What's going on, everybody? Today I'm going to be doing my October wrap-up, and if I had to describe my reading month for October, it would be somewhere between like, yeah, okay, or somewhere between those. It wasn't the greatest reading month. I thought the books were good, but it's just not my favorite genre. Like I wanted to read horror for October, and the only horror book I have really read was Dracula back in May. I don't know why I read it back in May. It was a poor choice, like in hindsight, you know how it's 2020 vision. But I did read it in May, and I wish I would have saved it for this. But that was the only horror book I had read. So I really wanted to focus on horror for this month, and I thought it would be no better way to do that than to read Stephen King. So I enjoyed the books, but I don't know how big of a fan of the genre I am in total. And I'm just going to jump in by starting with the very first book I read, which is Carrie. If you've watched the channel, you know that I have a pet peeve of having to read books in publication order if they exist in the same universe. And from what I hear, all the Stephen King novels belong in this type of multiverse that you learn about as you continue through his novels. So I had to start with Carrie. I know you could read them out of order, but it's just a pet peeve. I had to start with Carrie. And I'm glad I did. I only read 3.5 Stephen King books this month, but out of all those books, I feel like Carrie was a really good place to start. It was a great introduction to both Stephen King and I think the horror genre in general. I talk about it in my full review of this book, but it essentially helped me understand a few things about horror. And I saw this quote by a comedic fantasy author, and they essentially say the best comedic fantasy stories need a little bit of sorrow, or something along those lines. And this book almost made me wonder if the best horror novels need a little bit of hope to make the horror all that much horrific. And I think Carrie did a really good job of that. I talk more about this in the full review, so I'll just leave that there for you to check out if you want. But all in all, I was very happy with it. The second book, I didn't know anything about going in, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that Salem's Lot was inspired by and is essentially a retelling, or even can be seen as a sequel to Dracula. Like I said, I read Dracula in May, and I was bummed that I wasn't going to read it in October. I've had this itch to reread Dracula, and honestly, I think I would have caved if it wasn't for this book. Stephen King was able to retell the Dracula story in a new and unique way while bringing more to the table. This is also the first book I really start to notice that why Stephen King is known for his characterization skills. The depth of character in this story really, it makes the story. It's why the book's so good. The only big complaints I have is if you try to compare it to Dracula to begin with, which isn't really fair to Salem's Lot, but I couldn't help but making the comparison anyways. I was talking about this with one of the subscribers who decided to read along with me with this. But essentially, I think that if you're going to, I have no problem with people retelling classic stories. I love retellings of classic stories. But if you're going to do it, you have to do it in a way that you're not just constantly thinking and comparing it to the original. So either making it so different that it's harder to make the comparison, or by just doing such a good job, such an amazing piece of art that you blow the old one away. And I don't think that's what Salem's Lot did. It curbed my Dracula craving, and maybe it's only because I read Dracula first, but honestly, it just couldn't stand up next to it, in my opinion. So Salem's Lot, I really enjoyed. Not one of my favorite books of all time or anything, though. I don't really have much more to say about it than that. So I'm going to go into the third book I read in the month of October, which is The Shining. And this is the only Stephen King book I knew a little bit about before reading, because the Shining I just saw as a super popular old movie. I'd never seen it, but you hear a lot about it, and I've heard only good things about the movie. So I expected this book to just totally blow me out of the water. And if Salem's Lot introduced me to how well Stephen King was able to write characters, The Shining blew that out of the water. Like the characters in The Shining are so real and developed and fleshed out. I don't know if I've read anything besides, let's say, Game of Thrones and Joe Abercrombie's The Blade or First Law trilogy that really has characterization like Stephen King does in this book. The characters make the story. With that being said, not that impressed with the story itself. And I don't think it has to do at all with the writer or the skill of the author. I just think that this may not be my genre. It wasn't stimulating enough for me, and I was bored throughout, not most of it, but a lot of it. I also find it funny that, like I said, this was the only book that I had expectations coming into reading it, and it's the one I was least impressed with. And I think that says a lot about what expectations can do to the reading experience. Like, I've really started to enjoy going into reading new books without any expectations whatsoever. And it lets you experience the story more authentically, I guess is the right word I would try to say. Okay, so the fourth Stephen King book, I said I wanted to try to get through it by the end of the month, and I think I could have, but it's The Stand. I got about a third of the way through, maybe a fourth. I'd have to check and look. But I DNF'd it. It's not because it wasn't good. In fact, I keep bringing up Stephen King's skill with characters, and it's not even how he builds the characters up. It's how he's able to tell a story through character experience and thought processes. Like, it's amazing. And I think this really shines out in The Stand. The story is coming together beautifully. What it comes down to is this is about a virus that wipes out a lot of people. And I think I might have been a little bit COVID fatigued. I'm just done with this story. It's not that fault. It's not the book's fault. I think I was just a little COVID fatigued. I just did not want to push myself to finish that story. So instead of like just living in misery for the rest of the month, I DNF'd it, didn't go farther, and I decided to start a different book, which I will talk about in my November TBR, because talk about going into a book with no expectations or little expectations and just being blown away. Ooh, that's good. So I'll be talking about that one in my November TPR. But there's one more book that I have been reading this month, and it's the Voidwalker collection by Derek Bailey. I'm not done with it. I'm about halfway there. And out of all the books I read this month, I think that this book is the one that I was actually most interested in. The plot, the story, the setup. I don't know if it's the typical horror genre. I would say it's more of like a supernatural thriller. In fact, when he was describing the book to me in his initial email, he described it as like a Netflix suspense. And I agree with that. That is what this book gives you. I think that the story is more interesting. The characters are really fleshed out, but it's not delivered in quite as flawlessly as what Stephen King does. And few people could ever do that. But the only issue I'm really having with the story right now is that a lot of the character development comes through info dumps. And I'm used to info dumps with fantasy because typically a lot of fantasy authors info dump their magic systems. Might be one of the first times that I see character development done through info dumps. And sometimes it can be a bit much, but I'm really enjoying the book, and I imagine I'll finish it by the end of October, maybe early November, but I'm going to continue it because I'm really enthralled in the plot. I'm eager to see where it ends up. But with that being said, that's my month of October. That's how my month went. Like I said, I think that the books were good. The books are great. I just don't know if the genre is what I'm looking for, which is sad. Because I had such a great experience with Dracula that I was expecting to have the same experience with horror. And I am just, like, Stephen King isn't the whole horror genre. So I've still got a lot more of horror to experience. But my first initial toe dip into the horror pond, it doesn't seem to be my favorite. Anyways, let me know what you thought of the video. Let me know if you've read these books and what you think, and if you agree with me on them. I'll be back soon talking about my November TBR list because I'm really excited about it. And like I said, this book it's blowing me away so far. I'm not that far into it, but I'm glad I stopped and picked this one up. And like I said, I started it with very few expectations, and it's blowing me out of the waters. So I'll be back soon. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video to get notified when the next one drops. And until next time, I hope you're out there reading cool new books and exploring cool new worlds. And I'll be back soon. Thanks for watching.